It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Amara Dunn-Silver. Amara Dunn-Silver is the biocontrol specialist with the Cornell IPM program, part of Cornell's College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, you know. In this position, she supports the effective use of biocontrol solutions for all pests and any pests in agricultural commodities, as well as pests encountered by New Yorkers where they live, work, and play. When she's not at work, she enjoys watching all the beneficial insects visiting her garden, and the pictures, which I'm sure you'll see plenty of pictures of her garden, they're beautiful. So thank you, Amara.
Thank you, Jody. I've actually, Matt gave me one, so we'll have to, maybe we'll put that mic away so we don't have interference issues. Yeah, like many of the other presentations, I have some pictures from places where I currently or used to live that are not necessarily exactly what you should be doing. So that's okay. We're going to talk about those things, right? None of us are achieving IPM perfectly. We're all trying to do more IPM, and that is okay. So let's see, maybe if I stand over here. Whoa, there we go. I like to describe myself as someone who is experting. I don't know everything there is to know about biocontrol, but I do spend a lot of time thinking about biocontrol, wondering how it applies in different situations, and thinking about how I could communicate it more effectively. So I consider myself someone who is experting in biocontrol. And every time I give a talk like this, I always learn something from someone in the room. So that's what I'm expecting here today as well. What I expect from you is please ask questions. If you're in the room, I'd appreciate it if you raise your hand before you ask the question, but I don't mind being interrupted. I'd rather get your questions answered than get through all the material I've prepared. And I will ask you to participate with that poll everywhere, so keep that window up in your browser. This is what we're going to be talking about today in our final session of today. We're going to very briefly touch on recognizing beneficial insects. I won't go into depth on how to recognize all of them, but there are some resources in the back, and I'll point you to some resources as well. We're going to talk a little bit about why you might want to create habitat for beneficial insects. We're going to talk about how you create habitat for beneficial insects. And we're going to talk about some tips and tricks for creating habitat, especially as they intersect with pests around the perimeter. So all of the talks that have happened throughout the day have touched on a lot of things that we're going to touch on again. So in some ways, this is a little bit of a review and weaving together some different topics. Several of these points we're going to touch on could be whole talks in themselves. So they're going to be shortened and overviews, and I'll be directing you to more resources. There are a whole bunch of links that I will reference that I think hopefully can be sent out by email to everyone who's registered after. So don't panic if you can't grab the exact resource. We'll share those links later. All right. I'd like to start out by finding out a little bit more about all of you. So Matt's going to pull up a poll question. Would you describe yourself as a gardener? Okay, we're pulling up the question. Gardener, landscape professional, an educator, or something else? So I told you a little bit about who I am. I'd like to know who's in the room today. And you're allowed to pick more than one answer too. All right, so a lot of educators, also some landscape professionals, and some gardeners. Anyone want to say what other category they would? You don't have to share, but if anyone wanted to share and say, oh, this isn't up there, please include this list. Yeah. Pest management professional. Yes. Yeah. Government. I forgot government. Sorry. All right. All right. So thank you all for being here in the various roles that you play. We can go back to the slide. All right. I just have a couple more slides of laying some foundational background so we're all on the same page here. This is a slide of terminology just to get it kind of all out in the open. Don't panic, there's a lot of different pieces here. So I was introduced as the biocontrol specialist. That's just short for biological control, which just means living things control pests. A common example of biocontrol, and we're thinking about insects, is ladybugs. I have our ladybug here. And aphids. So the ladybugs, are natural enemies or biocontrol agents. I might use those terms interchangeably. They eat the pest. Biocontrol agents, natural enemies, are just one type of beneficial insect. So most folks are familiar with pollinators and how important they are. Bees are a really common pollinator, but there's also flies, beetles, other insect pollinators as well. Today I'll be using the term beneficial insect to include both pollinators and natural enemies of pests, so lumping them all together. The other thing I like to let folks know is I like to talk about this word bug. Because if there's any entomologists in the room, to an entomologist, the word bug means something very, very specific. Only certain insects are bugs. And I've had some entomologists approach me and be very concerned that I'm playing fast and loose with the word bug. To most people, to like everyone else who is not an entomologist, bug just means something creepy crawly. So that's how I'm going to be using the word today. Technically, insects have 6 legs, spiders and mites have 8 legs. I might more appropriately use the word arthropod to describe insects and spiders and mites, but that doesn't really roll off the tongue. So if you hear me use the word bug today and it doesn't, you think I'm not using it in the way that you have heard it before, it's okay. I'm going to use it a little bit more loosely. I'm also a big fan of this idea of not letting the perfect become the enemy of the good. So just wanted to be upfront that today we're going to be focusing on native perennial plants that are native to North America, especially Eastern North America. If you want to grow annuals too, that's okay. You're not a bad person if you like growing annual plants. And even if you like growing annual plants, that their only value is they look pretty in your yard, that is still value, and it's okay. You're not a bad person if you want to grow those plants. And it's also okay to grow plants that are not native to the area where you are. Please don't grow invasive plants, but just to let you know, the focus is on native perennial plants, not because that is the only thing you should be growing. That's just what we're focusing on today. If you would like to dive deeper into the weeds of annuals versus perennials and nativars and cultivars and things like that, there's some more details on this website, Steps to Creating Habitat for Beneficial Insects. The link will be in the resources that you'll get. It's broken down into these 4 steps. The choosing plant section has some more details about kind of pros and cons to these different types of plants. All right, on to recognizing beneficial insects. So I have done whole 45-minute, hour-long presentations about recognizing beneficial insects. We're not going to go that in depth today because there are so many beneficial insects and we have so little time. So here is just a sampling of some beneficial insects that you're seeing on this slide. Does anyone recognize these? If you're in the room, you can raise your hand and tell me. If you're on Zoom, you can type it into the chat just so that other folks can see on Zoom. Yeah. Yes. Yes, and we have 2 lady beetles, 7-spotted lady beetle and pink-spotted lady beetle, and a lady beetle larva. The important difference between the adult lady beetle, the larval lady beetles, and the pupal lady beetles was already talked about. What other beneficial insects do folks recognize? Yeah. Parasitic wasps, I think these are pupae on the hornworm in the bottom left right here. If you see a hornworm that looks like it has white pills on its back, leave it in the garden. Its life is short. Gil. Lacewing, adult lacewing, larval lacewing, garden spider. I saw a hand over here. The lacewing. Maze calligrapher. So full disclosure, I was not trained as an entomologist, so I don't know all the insects. But I think that, yeah, sometimes that makes it a little easier for me to notice the thing about insects that people who are also not entomologists don't see up front. What about this cute little guy? It's a syrphid or a hoverfly. Here's one, here's another. This is a fly larva. I'm not sure if it's a hoverfly larva or a different fly larva, also called maggots. They eat aphids. Very cool. We have an ambush bug in the middle here and a minute pirate bug down here. Very tiny, very cute. Much like the multicolored Asian lady beetles, also like to taste many things, but the bite doesn't hurt too much. And then, of course, there's the bees, right? And bees could be a whole other talk because there's incredible bee diversity, which is pretty cool. Lots of folks are familiar with honeybees. Many folks can recognize big bumblebees. They have fuzzy abdomens as opposed to carpenter bees that have shiny abdomens. Obviously, carpenter bees can be a pest issue when they are damaging wooden structures. When they are not damaging wooden structures, this is out in a research field. They're also important pollinators. But bees come in lots of other colors and shapes and sizes. We have bees that are all green. This bee has a green head and thorax. This one has yellow just around the rim of its abdomen. We have tiny bees. These longhorn bees in the lower right-hand corner, for those on Zoom, are super cute. If you go out to a garden in the late summer or early fall in the morning, you'll find them sleeping in flowers. Couple bees together in a flower. It's adorable. You should take a look. So these are just some of the bee diversity that we have here in New York State, and they are doing important pollination work in a lot of our crops, in addition to being great parts of the ecosystem. And then I wanted to highlight two other insect natural enemies on the ground that people don't often notice because they're on the ground, but I think it's good to be aware of. So rove beetles. These are beetles that live on the soil surface or just below the soil surface, so they're not very easy to see, but they are great predators. Lots of soil invertebrates, including slugs and snails. Who doesn't want fewer slugs and snails in your garden? Eggs, thrips, and they can also eat weed seeds. The distinguishing feature of a rove beetle, if you find one, so they're beetles, like lady beetles, they have those hard shells that cover their wings. On a rove beetle, these elytra or wing covers are short, so the abdomen sticks out the back. So I think it looks like they're wearing little short capes. But these little superhero beetles, we definitely want in our spaces. And then carabid beetles or ground beetles. They'll eat all sorts of arthropods, bugs, slugs and snails. Most of them live on the ground, so you may not see them. Sometimes I see them running quickly across the sidewalk. They often have these really prominent jaws because they're predators and also eat seeds, and they're very fast. Some people call them the cheetahs of the insect world. All right, any questions about beneficial insects while we pull up the quiz slide? Question, poll question, not a quiz. All right, so I'm curious, before we move on to this next section, now that we've talked a little bit about these beneficial insects, are you already creating habitat for beneficial insects? Yes, no, or I'm not sure, and I'm not sure is an acceptable answer because we haven't talked about what it means to create that habitat yet. Bring my water over here. All right, so a lot of folks are already doing this, so I may be preaching to the choir. That's okay. This is a fun thing to talk about. All right, let's move on to why then are we going to create habitat for beneficial insects? I'm sorry, Matt, I have another poll question. So since so many folks are already doing this, why do you think it's important? Because you want to be a good environmental steward, you want to protect pollinators, you think it'll help with pest control, maybe there's some other reason. If you have another reason and you want to tell me about it while folks are answering, that's fine. Or it's okay to say you don't think it's important too. This poll is anonymous, no one will know if you just don't think it's important, that's okay. All right, I love the honesty, thank you. All right, I think folks who have answered, who are going to answer probably have answered. And let's talk a little bit about some of these reasons. Yeah, thanks, Matt. All right, so someone mentioned previously this idea of declining insect populations. How many people have heard or seen some version of this story? It's pretty well percolated throughout the news. Insects are declining, insect apocalypse, collapse of insects. insects are dying off, a lot of the pictures pull out some of the pollinators that people are most familiar with or feel most connected to, like honeybees or monarchs. And while there's a lot of reasons why this decline in insects is happening, one part of the reason we think is a loss of habitat. And so creating habitat for these beneficial insects should help with this problem of insect decline. And for that reason, these ideas of ecologically responsible landscaping are becoming more popular. There's more information about them, more people are putting up signs that say some version of this is a pollinator-friendly garden. And if you work in landscaping, it is possible, I don't know, I'm curious, if more people are asking for landscaping that aligns with this. Seeing at least one nod. Okay. Some folks may also be familiar with this homegrown national park movement. And this is the idea that the idea is everyone can do a little piece, right? If everyone has a yard, you can all do something small in your yard, and that makes a difference when you all do it together. And so they have this map where they are documenting how many people and estimating acres of habitat. And this idea that if we all chip in a little bit, we can make a difference. So this is one reason you might be interested in creating habitat. There are also a lot of benefits to these perennial plants that are native to this area, which, as I said, is a thing we're focusing on today. Deer were talked about a lot in the first presentation of the day. A lot of these native perennials are at least deer tolerant. It's not that the deer won't eat them, but they won't decimate them. So here is an example from a demonstration garden I have outside of one of the research greenhouses in Geneva. And what you may be able to see is this New England aster has been pruned. It's been pruned by deer. The deer seem to really like the asters in this planting. They don't seem to bother the other perennials, but they never eat it to the ground and kill it. And actually, I'll talk a little bit later about how this is actually working out for me, that the deer eat it. Some of these native perennials, because they're co-evolved with other local pests, whether they're insects or diseases, they can also be a little bit more resilient there. Not that they won't get the disease, but the disease won't kill it. I was actually just part of a conversation earlier today about powdery mildew on wild bergamot. The wild bergamot is going to get the powdery mildew probably every year, but it won't kill the plant. It's okay, don't worry about it. Perennials do take longer to establish, but once they are established, they can be lower maintenance. So Barb was talking at the beginning of the day about thinking about that maintenance plan going forward. And my example here, so this is blue false indigo, Baptisia australis. I planted this 3 years ago and it just started blooming this year. So very slow to establish, but once they get going, they can be these huge, beautiful mounds of plants, and they have these really cool legume flowers. The native perennials can also help soak up extra water, and they can be more resilient to drought. And this, I think, is going to be an ongoing thing we're dealing with, where we're seeing increasingly the rain comes all at once and then it's dry. We have really dry years, we have really wet years. When there's too much water around, a plant that's established perennial in the ground, it's going to have a bigger root system than an annual, can take up more water. Also in the dry years, it's got a bigger root system, it's going to be more resilient to that drought. Whereas if you put an annual in the spring and you have a really dry summer, you're going to have to water it all year. And plants that support beneficial insects are beautiful. So these are not all perennials, but this is an example from a house where I used to live. This is an aromatic aster, got some black-eyed Susans, some sneezeweed in the back. I think there's some yarrow and there's some annuals in here too. They're really beautiful flowers. And then this is a demonstration bed in Geneva. Again, wild bergamot, echinacea, some blanket flower. They're really beautiful plants. All right. So how do you create habitat for beneficial insects? Another question for you. What is the biggest barrier for you to providing habitat for beneficial insects? And there's a lot of very reasonable worries. It might take too much time. might cost too much money. You might not have access to the right equipment. You might not be convinced that the benefits are worth the costs. You might need more information before you can start implementing this. There might be some other reason, and I'd love to hear it if you have another reason. Or you might say, no barriers, I'm good to go. And I know a lot of folks are already doing it, but that doesn't mean the barriers aren't there. I'm curious if anyone would like to share another reason. Yeah. Oh, soil is so bad, can't even grow zucchini. Now I feel like this is a challenge because I bet, and someone might know this, does anyone know of a perennial native to this area plant that thrives in poor soil? Jody. Lupin. Oh, I didn't know that. Good to know. It probably depends on exactly what way your soil is bad, right? Soil can be bad because it's heavy clay, because it's rocky, because it's, yeah. Yarrow? Somebody also said yarrow is a plant that tolerates poor soils. And I think that gets back to the right plant, right place question as well. I bet there's other ideas out there too, yeah. A plant with a deep taproot can maybe get below the poor soil to access some better soil. Some of the perennial sunflowers do well in poor soils. As I said, folks are a wealth of knowledge, especially Master Gardener volunteers. Oh, yeah, it does. It can take time, right? We're all busy, right? And we have to make choice about how we use our time. All right, so there's a lot of barriers, and those are all legitimate. One of the barriers, hopefully, we'll address a little bit today, is talking about kind of what are those steps, what good habitat looks like, and then how you might go about establishing it. So that will be kind of addressing the information barrier. I wish I could give us all 10 more hours in every day. Sadly, no. All right, so what makes good habitat for beneficial insects? And I think this has been talked about before. All living things, whether they're pests trying to get into your home or beneficial insects, need food and water, shelter, and protection from things that are going to harm them. We're going to focus today on the food and shelter piece, since that has to do with the habitat creation and what you're planting. I will touch briefly on the protection from pesticides. And I want to point out this cute little bee coming out of the ground here, because we're going to talk about ground nesting bees in a moment as well. All right, so food, if we're thinking about food for beneficial insects, the bottom line is the more flowers, the better. And there was actually a study done in Michigan that quantified this. They counted flowers, they counted insect natural enemies. They found when there were more flowers, there were more insect natural enemies. The flowers do need to be something that has a lot of pollen and nectar in them. And your goal is to have something blooming all season long, from very early in the spring until it frosts in the late fall. And part of the reason here, and this is a theme we'll return to, is, as we saw a few slides earlier, there's a huge diversity of beneficial insects. And so if you're trying to provide habitat and food and shelter for a huge diversity of insects, it is unsurprising that you would need a diversity of habitats and foods, because no one thing is going to be good for all of them. So I said you need to pick flowers that have lots of pollen and nectar. It is reasonable to ask, how do you know if a flower produces lots of pollen and nectar? And there are a couple of good ways to know. As someone who is out there gardening, picking plants, increasingly, if you're going to any place that sells plants, it's increasingly likely they'll have some kind of label on them. So people have recognized, those who sell plants have recognized there's a market for plants that feed pollinators, and so they're often labeled. And the good news is that plants that are good for pollinators are often good for other beneficial insects as well. There are also many, many, many lists. If you search on the internet, there are many lists of plants, many places where you can find information about which plants are good for pollinators and insect natural enemies. I do suggest that you kind of turn your search towards lists that are coming from reputable sources. things like universities or extension offices, because there's a whole lot of gardening information online and it is of varying quality. In the website, the Creating Habitat for Beneficial Insects website, step number 2 is choosing plants. And so I have some links there. There's a couple different databases where you can search by geography and soil type and amount of sun. If you want to get like a really long list of all sorts of plants that you can include, if you want to look at woody plants and herbaceous plants. So there's some resources linked there. Some folks are really interested in like a short list. They don't want to know all the plants, they just want to know a few plants. If you're a short list person, I do have some printed copies of plant lists in the back of the room that I think folks saw already. I do have them separated into perennials and annuals. I think all of the perennials are native to this area. The annuals are a mixture of native and not native. And those, for folks who are on Zoom, those are available digitally as well. I think they're not up on the website yet, but I can get PDFs to folks. We're in the process of getting them up on the website. If you are really super interested in plants that feed specifically natural enemies and you love spreadsheets, I do also have linked from the website a really giant spreadsheet where I looked at extension resources and university research and made notes. Okay, this study said that yarrow had these 5 insects, and this study said that black-eyed Susans had these 6 insects. It's a really big spreadsheet. It's for folks who want to do a really deep dive on that, but it is a resource that's available. And then the last way to know if a flower produces lots of pollen and nectar is just to look for the insects. So this is a picture, again, from a research field. I think these are mostly carpenter bees. This one has a shiny abdomen, you can see here. At a certain time in the fall, the goldenrod is covered with carpenter bees. This is a field on an agricultural research farm. I'm not concerned about carpenter bees as a structural pest here, although I recognize in some other places they can be structural pests. But the fact that so many bees are visiting this plant is a good clue that the goldenrod is a good resource. If you're out shopping for plants and the garden center has plants in an outdoor space or a space that has like big open windows, you can sometimes walk around and just see which flowers are being visited. So that can be a really quick and easy way to tell. And I think this can be especially useful if you are looking at different cultivars of perennial plants. I know some folks have concerns. For example, that we have increasingly different color variations of echinacea. Do they have the same pollen and nectar resources? There's not a simple answer. It really depends on the cultivar. But if you see the flowers blooming and insects are visiting it, it's probably got some good resources. The other piece about flowers is to think about maximizing diversity, in this case of flower shape. So this is because, again, we're feeding a diverse group of insects. This honeybee here, you can hopefully see on this picture, has a really long tongue. This makes it much easier for the bee to access nectar that's in a long tubular flower, like this beard tongue flower here. A fly, like this hoverfly or syrphid fly, and wasps tend to have short mouth parts. That means that they're going to access pollen or nectar only if they're in very open flowers or very tiny flowers. So it's not that one shape of flower is better than the other, it's that it's good to have some of each. Similarly, providing shelter for different insects is going to look different. So in this picture, we have a few different examples. We have some mulch. We have a bunching grass, which I'll talk more about in a moment. And we have some bare ground. And these are going to do different things for different insects. You might recall from a few slides ago that cute little ground bee coming out of the bare ground. Note the difference between ground bees and ground nesting wasps. The ground bees are solitary and important pollinators, and they actually need bare ground. So if you put mulch everywhere and there's no bare ground, there's no spots for the ground nesting bees. If you have all bare ground and no mulch, the mulch is providing some good shelter for ground beetles and spiders. So again, there's no perfect way to landscape your yard. It's about a mixture and making choices that are right for you and right for the risks you're dealing with and the situation you have. I also like to encourage folks to embrace the mess. You don't have to embrace the mess everywhere. I realize that at institutions and certain parts of houses with certain landscaping clients, certain spaces just need to be neat, and that's okay, right? You don't have to leave your whole yard a mess, but if there are some parts of the yard that you're okay with being a little messier, or can be messier a little bit longer into the spring, those can provide important shelter. So what you might be able to see here, there's a little bit of purple. This is actually a hyacinth blooming amongst some perennial stems that I had not cut down yet in the spring. If you can delay your spring garden cleanup, that will provide a little more shelter for insects that are still developing. A lot of folks want to know when. Tell me what date I can start cleaning up my garden. It's complicated, so I wrote a blog post about it. And the blog will be in the list of resources that you'll get because there's not one simple answer. And again, remember that diversity is a strength. You don't have to have all of your yard or all of the property a particular way. I said we'd talk a little bit more about bunching grasses. So these perennial grasses, rather than spreading across a lawn, grow in a bunch. They're very pretty. This is little blue stem. It can still get like 3 or 4 feet tall. There's also big blue stem, which gets even taller. Very attractive native grasses that provide really good habitat for ground beetles. The ground beetles spend the winter there, and then in the spring they come out and start foraging. And there's actually some more resources through this Habitat Planning for Beneficial Insects from the Xerces Society about bunching grasses and how they provide shelter for ground beetles. And then this is my brief discussion about pesticides and protecting beneficial insects from pesticides. I think the bottom line here is, do you really need to spray, right? Because some pesticides will harm beneficial insects, and practicing good IPM means using pesticides judiciously and not using them when you don't need them. So these are just 2 examples that I've used in my garden. This is my highly technical homemade device for capturing Japanese beetles. Cut the lid off of a soda bottle and then invert it so you have a little funnel, knock the beetles off into the bottle, stick the bottle in the freezer, and the next morning you empty the beetles into the compost and you collect more beetles. In a small setting, I think this is an appropriate way to deal with Japanese beetles. The other example are white grubs that I dug up from my lawn as I was digging up the lawn to put in more flower beds. And this is illustrating the idea that a healthy lawn can tolerate a certain number of white grubs. Just because you have a white grub doesn't mean you need a pesticide in your lawn. I will admit that I am more of the philosophy of, if it's green, it counts as a lawn. Not everybody is, that's okay. But you can still have a very healthy and more traditionally healthy lawn. I'm not quite sure how to describe it. A lawn that's actually all grass. You can still have that and tolerate some grubs in your lawn. Again, with their blog post about choosing pesticides and risk to beneficial insects. Gil. Oh, good thought. Do you need, I wonder, you might pay attention to then, okay. Gil is sharing that you can also use this highly technical soda bottle funnel to collect spotted lanternflies. The idea with the funnel is that the insects aren't very good at flying out the small hole of the funnel, so you can knock them in and dispose of them that way. All right, 4 steps for creating habitat. So again, sometimes I do whole talks about this. We're not going to go into detail of all the steps, but some of these will come up again as we're talking about the tips and tricks. Basically, you have to choose a spot where you want to put the plants. You have to choose the plants, and I've mentioned that page a little bit already. Step 2, managing weeds. Brian talked about weeds, and I have more details about some of your different options for weed management, and then actually doing the planting. And we'll touch on these steps as we go through our next section. All right, we're doing good. So our last section is tips and tricks to create habitat for beneficial insects. And this is where we're kind of pulling all the pieces together. And I'll touch on some of these questions about, okay, but how does this connect with keeping clear space around my building and some of the other perimeter pests we've talked about today. So first question is, and this is something that Barb asked at the beginning of the day, is what's your aesthetic? What are you hoping for? There's no one right way to have habitat for beneficial insects. So on the first picture on the left here, we have some flowers in a raised bed surrounded by mulch. It's very neat and tidy. In the next picture, we have more of a meadow situation. The plants are getting tall, some of them are falling over. People don't really care. These are two different ways of doing habitat, and either are okay. The important thing is to ask which one is right for you or your customer or your institution in a particular spot. And then these next two pictures are examples of two different plants. So butterfly milkweed is a lovely milkweed that tends to stay pretty short. If anyone's ever grown the common milkweed, it gets pretty tall, sometimes it falls over. It's a pretty wild plant, not something you want in the front of a nice manicured garden bed, but a butterfly milkweed might be more appropriate for that spot. And then in this picture over here, we have New England aster. New England asters, if you just let them grow, can really get kind of tall, kind of weedy, fall over, they're kind of a mess. However, if you prune them around Memorial Day, some folks may have heard of the Chelsea chop, which is just pruning your perennials around Memorial Day. Or if the deer prune your perennials around Memorial Day, which mine usually do, the plant will be more compact and bushy. So for some of these perennials, how you grow it can give you more of the look you're looking for. In some cases, picking the right plant for the right place, as Barb mentioned, is part of creating that aesthetic that you're looking for. When to plant. So how many have heard fall is for planting? All right. Fall is often, folks been pushing, fall is a good time to do planting. Usually we think about spring is when we plant, and that's often when there's a lot of reasons why it might make sense to start a project in the spring. Maybe it coincides with the end of the school year or when volunteers are available or other things like that. But there are a lot of benefits to planting in the fall if that works for you. It can be less stressful for transplants because the nights are cooler. Overall, it's not as hot. There tends to be a little bit more moisture in the soil. And so it can be a little bit easier to establish the transplants than if you're doing it in late spring, early summer when it's getting warmer. You can also direct seed perennials in the fall because a lot of these perennials need some sort of stratification or conditioning in order to stimulate germination. If you just plant them inside like you would start tomato seeds, they may not germinate. They need that cold and moist freezing and thawing to stimulate germination. This is a picture of me testing that out last fall. So I had some raised beds, put in some seeds, and I've been watching this spring to see which perennials came up. Interestingly, these raised beds were previously used as a weed demonstration garden. So I have also been demonstrating the challenges of establishing plants when you have a really vibrant seed bank. And this was actually after all of last summer, the area had been tarped with a black tarp. So we did a little bit of weed control, but there's still some weeds there. Another advantage to planting in the fall is you can spend your summer doing weed control so that you have that extra time to get a jump starter on that weed seed bank, getting weeds out of the space. You can still transplant perennials in the spring, just be mindful of the water. Maybe plant them earlier in the spring or be sure you're keeping up with the watering, especially as it gets warmer. Where to plant? So Barb mentioned right plant, right place. Won't go into all those details, but that's really important for success. Related to that is when you're picking the plant for the space, how big is it going to get? Because the perennials will start out very small and they do grow slowly, but they can get quite big. That blue false indigo, is a little tiny seedling. Now it's about this size. I have some plants that they're bushes, which is great. I think you can cut the foliage and use them in flower arrangements, but just planning for the fact that the plants will grow. Several folks have talked about planting too close to a structure. So this is one of those IPM True Confession pictures. This is from a house I used to live in. You can see I did put some gravel in right next to the house. I remembered that you weren't supposed to mulch right up to the house, but I had already planted some lilies like right next to the foundation. So not the best in terms of plants farther away from the house. I could do better. I will say that since I planted these lilies, the lily leaf beetle population has continued to grow. So the lilies may not be there anymore. So that will help a little bit. But yeah, be mindful about leaving some space so that you're not planting right up next to the house. Don't do as I did in this picture. Weed management. Brian talked about weed management, so I don't have to go too much into detail, but I just want to say the more weed management you do ahead of planting the perennials, the better off you're going to be. And Barb mentioned this as well in the morning. You're really your future self will thank you if you do more weed management up front. The best weed management method is going to depend on your setting and on how you're doing the planting. And so I have this whole step 3 about managing weeds. For example, if you're seeding a larger area to create a meadow, mowing is a great way to take care of annual weeds. Mowing won't work so great for perennial weeds, and it's not going to work if you transplant it into a bed next to your house, right? So there's all these pros and cons to the different weed management strategies, and those details are on the website. And I didn't want to leave out some notes about welcoming good insects and not bad insects. And I think a lot of these things have actually been touched on already, but so there'll just be a couple of reminders. Because there are some intersections with this idea of we're planting these flowers, but we just talked about all these pests that we don't want to bring into or close to our houses. So first up, stinging insects. And Joellen talked about a lot of these things already. So just some reminders, recognizing the difference between a social stinging insect that lives in a colony versus one that lives by itself. The solitary stinging insects, like this one here, are much less likely to sting you. They're less aggressive compared to this paper wasp. There are many species of stinging insects, right? So your identification of a stinging insect is going to give you more information about its habitats, about its risks to you as a person. As was already mentioned, they can be great predators, especially caterpillars. And a lot of us have too many caterpillars in our garden. And they'll be attracted to nectar as well. So yes, a lot of these flowers can be food for stinging insects. However, a lot of these stinging insects, even the ones that live in colonies, tend to, not always, be less aggressive when they are foraging compared to when they're close to their nest or their colony. So I think the take home here with creating habitat for beneficial insects and protecting yourself from stinging insects is thinking about the location. Where is a stinging insect? Where is the nest? What kind of risk does that pose to people? And it is really important to evaluate your own risk. So some individuals are at much higher risk because of allergies, or if it's a school or a place where there's lots of kids, right? There's situations where the risk is going to be different. So evaluating that risk in each setting. My experience with growing wildflowers is I see stinging insects visiting the wildflowers all the time. I have never experienced them being aggressive. That doesn't mean it's not a thing you need to worry about, but I think that you can definitely create habitat for beneficial insects around spaces where you're living or working or learning, and you'll be okay. Spiders. I know the idea of a friendly spider may not resonate with everyone, but just a quick note to say the spiders that are attracted to flowers either because they're eating insects, in this case, sadly a bee, but it happens, or other insects, these are not the same species as the spiders that are likely to be causing problems in your house and being considered indoor pests. The bottom line here is that flowers outside is not what's causing your spider problem inside. Not all ants are pests. I think this was also covered already. Some of them eat weed seeds, some of them eat other insects. Jody talked about ants on peonies and how they're actually protecting the peony. Some ants are going to be tending aphids on plants, and so in that way they're pests because they're protecting the aphids from other natural enemies. But again, I think flowers outside are not what's causing your ant problem inside. Don't plant them too close to the house. But don't not plant flowers just because you're afraid of getting ants in the house. And ticks. I think that Joellen covered this all really well already. But a lot of people ask me, oh, if I plant wildflowers, is this tick habitat? And I think all the things Joellen shared really apply here. Thinking about where are people, assessing the tick population in your area, thinking about, okay, where am I going to put a meadow versus where am I not going to put a meadow? Thinking about where we pile dead leaves, don't pile them at the edge of the lawn. I have one more question for you. Promise, last one. After today's presentation, will you create habitat for beneficial insects? Yes, no, or maybe. All right, I'm going to switch back to the last slide. Thank you, Matt, for toggling back and forth. And that's all I have for you. Thank you for hanging in here until the end of the day. I do have my email address, blog, Instagram, and links will also be going out afterwards. And I'm happy to take questions before we wrap up.